Tonight, we're live in Werribee in Melbourne's fast-growing outer west. With cost of living biting, particularly here in the suburbs, there's heated debate over whether wages should keep up. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm David Speers. We're coming to you live from Wyndham Cultural Centre tonight. This is one of the fastest growing areas in Australia, and it's great to have so many of you here with us. Now, joining me on the panel, Senior Economist Gabriela de Souza, the CEO of the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia, Alexi Boyd, Minister for Skills and Training, Brendan O'Connor, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and National Senate Leader, Bridget McKenzie, and writer and journalist Lech Blaine, who travelled the country speaking to voters during the election campaign. Great to have you all here. And remember, you can stream us on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. Our first question tonight comes from Bronwyn Clark.
The pace of population growth here in Werribee is being replicated right across the country in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. Already 5.2 million people live in high growth areas where there's not enough local jobs, key workers have long and expensive commutes, where households have high levels of financial stress and less access to vital health services. Brendan O'Connor, how will the government end postcode discrimination for people in outer suburbs?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, David, and thank you for the question, Bronwyn. And can I say, as a local member, I live not far from here, and as a local member, I deal with these issues. As a local resident, I deal with them as well. And I think you're right. This region has been exponentially growing over the last couple of decades. It's really the answer as to why Melbourne has grown so rapidly, if you look at Melton and Wyndham and other municipalities. And so I think there's a combination of things that need to be done to mitigate the pressures on people and also deal with those congestions that you referred to. Firstly, I think, and I was fortunate enough of announcing this when we were last in government, I think, and we should be doing more of this, is announcing planning for employment hubs in areas that are growing very rapidly, so they're not forced or compelled to travel long distances if we can avoid that. So I think planning at local, state and federal levels where we are trying to attract employment to the region will at least stop some of the commuting that does occur here, but probably even worse in parts of Sydney. But I understand your point there.
Just explain what the employment hub is that you're talking about, and is this something new that you're talking about for this sort of area? Well,
certainly it was an announcement we made in 2012, and frankly it wasn't large enough in terms of scale, but the concept was absolutely right, and that is that we'd find land, state or federal land, or possibly even private land. We'd work with other governments and industry and look to invest in those areas so that we could ensure that people that are looking for employment could work much closer to home. That would stop the commuting, and it would also mean that you'd have more time with your families and you'd be in your communities. And I think that would be one approach that should be taken, and I think that's a responsibility of all tiers of government, and I think industry would like to partner that.
So, sorry, you find the land, and then what do you do?
Then you'd be suggesting, and you'd find ways and incentives to attract businesses to actually build. So
subsidise new business.
It may well be forms of subsidy. It might be cheaper land because you zone it commercially. It's a combination of things that could happen to attract businesses. You'd engage with the industry and businesses before you make those planning decisions. Right. But it can happen.
Because you didn't talk about this, I don't think, in the election campaign. So is this a new idea?
This was something that we were doing. In fact, there was
10 years ago.
And I can recall that. And I just think more of that should have happened over the last decade in terms of Melbourne.
And you're going to do it now?
Well, I think that's something we should be exploring, and I think that's why I guess I'm responding to that question.
Announcing something.
And I'm not announcing anything, David, but I do think it's a really important thing that when we look to plan cities, and I do believe we need to plan them better. And as someone who lives in a fast-growing region,
All right, so you look at that and you might do something.
I think that's something that should be done through Council of Governments, through federal, state, and local governments, because of the different responsibilities that each tier of government have working with industry. That's one thing. I do think we need to see more investments. I know that the state government has announced the construction of a hospital in Melton. That's overdue, in my view, and I welcome that. I do think sometimes instead of build it and they will come, they come and then we expect to build it. And I think if we can actually anticipate the growth in a more effective way and plan more effectively for people, we wouldn't have the scarcity of resources and the congestion to which you speak.
Bridget McKenzie?
Yeah, well, thank you, Bronwyn, for your question, and it's fantastic to be back in Werribee. You are a young and fast-growing, vibrant city, and if I think back 3 decades ago, you were surrounded by farmland, and it's a very, very different community now with a lot of different pressures and tension, and the sense of community that you may have had for locals versus who you aspire to be now. My understanding is there was a promise 2012, 2013 for the state government to develop this precinct where you've got some great foundational tenants such as Victoria University, such as the Mercy Hospital, I understand, and also facilities for legal firms. But you need to be attracting more to that. And really, the state Labor government has dropped the ball on this. And I hate to, Brendan, it's one of yours, a Labor government. Because
I'll just jump in there because you guys have just had 9 years in government federally. Well, should you have done more?
Well, we've put the money on the table for a faster rail service to partner with the state government between Melbourne and Geelong, which will actually mean that Werribee citizens and residents won't be necessarily having to use that to get into Melbourne. We hope that, Geelong will come here because you're going to have exciting employment opportunities right here. And students that live in Geelong may not have to study at Deakin. They might come and study at Victoria University here locally. So that's our investment. But, I think Brendan's right. The Wyndham Council and community wants to grow and prosper. They need to have that planning work done. It was promised to be done nearly a decade ago with the state government, and I'd support that.
Lech, Bronwyn talks about this postcode discrimination. How real do you believe that is? How significant is this problem of differentiated services between what you get in the inner city and what you might find in the outer suburbs?
Yeah, it's massive. There's a discrimination by postcode. There's a level of cultural discrimination. There's a feeling within a lot of these places that they're not being represented within politics, within the mainstream culture of the country. So I am from Toowoomba. I've got a lot of family in Ipswich. I've seen what's happened in Ipswich over a long period of time in terms of politicians, local politicians generally, but also state politicians rushing in to celebrate these new great developments which are going to deliver an endless supply of jobs, but the infrastructure isn't ready. And so there needs to be ambition to build and to grow, but there also needs to be commitment from politicians where you're prioritising the services and the infrastructure in areas like this, just as well as in areas of like the inner city or metropolitan parts of Australia.
Do politicians get it? Do they understand areas like this?
Lots of politicians come from areas like this. I think it's when you have been in politics and you're dealing with a bunch of different issues and you're being hounded by different lobbyists, whether it be developers or so forth, it can be a quick fix to say we're going to approve this suburb, but there needs to be an equal commitment to make sure that the services that are being supplied here are of similar quality to other parts of Australia,
and
where
this is the problem, isn't it?
where they've been existing, for a lot longer. So I understand that there's difficulties. It's hard, it doesn't happen overnight, but yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Gabriela, let me ask you. There's this geographical divide that we're talking about, that Bronwyn's touching on, but there's also a generational divide too, isn't it? Because here we're talking about a lot of young families here in Werribee and in suburbs like this around Australia. How does that play out in terms of the generational divide?
Yeah, so I think what's really important, and what I'm really sorry didn't come out in a lot of the election conversation was a real conversation about intergenerational equity and the housing market. So we got an announcement very late in the election campaign about the super for housing, which I thought was pretty good. But I think we haven't had a conversation about actually how do we try and make housing more affordable through increasing the supply of housing in areas that are actually closer to the CBD. And that needs to be part of a much bigger conversation about the role of local councils in terms of approving those applications or in terms of creating more medium-term density in a lot of those suburbs that are in the outer ring of the CBD.
And Alexi, when we look at the growth, and a few people have touched on it already, here in the city of Wyndham, where we are, the population set to grow by more than 60% over the coming 20 years. Now, that's a lot of growth. Do you think services and some of the things that Bronwyn touched on are keeping up?
Well, certainly services are very important to the small business community, just as they are to the residents as well. And touching on what we were saying before about the employment, it's definitely beneficial for small businesses to be able to use local people and to have that availability of employees, to have workers who are coming from miles away and arriving exhausted because they've spent an hour and a half on the train is not the best. And it's good to build a community. And so many times we see small businesses as the backbone of a community, building it up and creating that community. And this is what is so vibrant and wonderful about communities like this, is that through the differences and the different types of people that are within the community, multicultural, different ages, intergenerational, things like that, that's how we get those unique small business communities as well. But it's important that the services are there for small business too. And it was pleasing to see when Brendan was talking about planning. Well, we have to have small businesses as part of that planning phase. What is the strategy? Thinking about what is the strength of your small business community, even from the beginning, and how that can be grown upon.
Let me just come back to you, Bronwyn. You're actually the CEO of the National Growth Areas Alliance, which I think represents councils from areas like this around the big cities across Australia. What's an example of the pressures that are being felt by people here and the services that are lacking?
Well, we did some research after, well, not after the pandemic because it's still going, but we found that 20% of people are under severe financial stress. There's a real lack of mental health services. In a place like Werribee, there's on average 130 babies born every week. Now, where are their parents going to work? Where are they going to go to school? That's a primary school each month. And on top of that, the home builder incentive that came out, as an economic stimulus, it's important, but it's brought forward growth in the outer suburbs by 5, 6, 7 years, and there's no infrastructure planned to match it.
Well, that's a good point. That's a lot of babies every week. And one thing we've had come through very strongly in the questions tonight is the pressure on childcare, or the lack of childcare availability and also affordability in this area. That brings us to our next question. Mason Asadi. Mason, just tell us a bit about your situation.
Yes, actually, as you would probably know, we have got a lack and shortage of most of the kind of required facility and infrastructure, like childcare, schools, public transport, parks, playground. Actually, whatever you name, I can tell that that's not actually in satisfying standard, in Wyndham. And we have got different issues. For myself, before COVID, I'm not sure if you have been at Tarnit train station, which was just headache. But at the moment, I'm looking for somewhere we have got a 6-month-old baby just to put in childcare. But, I've checked for childcare centers. So all of them, they say that they have got kind of, one-day spot available. So I'm thinking actually to take him to city, but, because that is still too young, so he cannot walk. I have to take him, on the pram to take it to city using train. So that is very actually, would be frustrating for me. So my question is that, as you should know regarding the people and the number of actually children that they are being born in this area, why, don't the government plan ahead before people facing this issue and then get back to you that, to find a solution for that?
Okay, well, yeah, and thank you, Mason. Let's stick to the childcare issue in particular. But Mason's inability to find a childcare place. Bridget, McKenzie, let me come to you first on that. Why can't someone like Mason find a childcare place here?
Well, he lives in a community where a lot of young families are residing, and there are particular suburbs and even regional centres where that is the challenge. Our government has, the previous government, my apologies, but last government invested $11 billion just this financial year in supporting families like yours to be able to access affordable childcare. But you do need those places available, and they are often and predominantly private providers. So I would be suggesting that council make sure that there's land available for those private providers to set up. The demand is clearly here. You've got structures at a federal level to support families with affordable childcare going forward. But you're right, it is about infrastructure being made available. I think Brendan and others have made a really good point. Federal governments have a specific role in our country. Local and state governments also have really the priority authority around planning for the future. And then we obviously come in, and in this case, Brendan's government will be coming in to really support that local vision and the state government's priorities in terms of developing communities.
Well, some level of government clearly has to do more on this. I mean, there was a recent report by Victoria University and the Mitchell Institute that mapped so-called childcare deserts in Australia, as they called it. About 9 million Australians, roughly a third of the population, live in childcare deserts. Now, this region we're in, about a third of it is classed as a childcare desert, where there are roughly 3 kids for every available childcare place. So, Gabriela, you can see that leaves people like Mason unable to find a spot.
Absolutely, and it is really, really like part of the intergenerational thing that I guess I was talking about as well. Like, I think we've done a really good job about making sure that the people within our childcare centres are well educated and credentialed. But in doing so, I think there is a trade-off that we have implicitly made with most people, for example, are able to rely on their grandparents for that childcare. But sadly, for people like myself, who is a migrant, if I were to have a child, I can't rely on my mum because she lives in India. So it's just really, I think, there is a certain element of, yes, it is valuable to have that early child care learning framework and someone certified to be able to do that. But at the same time, a lot of families just need someone to look after their kid and to do something that a grandparent would ordinarily do.
And Brendan, we know Labor has promised to improve and increase childcare subsidies. But what about the places and the staff that are required to fill these places?
Yeah, and that look, the example that's been raised is exactly the point about scarcity in areas of growing demand, and we need to attend to it. As David alluded to, the incoming Albanese Labor government will be making childcare more affordable. It's a very significant investment of taxpayers' dollars to make it easier and more affordable, but we have to deal with 2 things that's been touched on. One is more places, more availability, but also more staff, because we have acute skill shortages compounded by the pandemic, because we had the suspension of the permanent skilled migration stream, and there's another problem we've had, which we may go to later, but that is the flight of people on visa holders because they're not in receipt of JobKeeper or JobSeeker, so they left the country. And we lost significant labour supplies in areas like aged care and childcare, and so there's a very big job to do, but we're very proud of the fact that we're certainly putting a lot of money into making it more affordable, but we have to look at places in areas of growing demand like
Well, we will come back to the skilled migration challenge as well, but just on this, our next question is also from Sarah Wendelborn, and Sarah, you've also got some issues when it comes to childcare.
My question is, with the cost of living rate rising, many stay-at-home parents are being forced back to work. How are families expected to survive financially when the childcare costs for the working class are huge? Yeah,
and Sarah, you've got a little one and you're hoping to have them in childcare pretty soon.
Yeah, at the end of the
How are you going with your hunt for a spot?
We've found a spot.
Okay, well done.
But the cost of it, I'll be going back to work to pay for childcare, pretty much.
Yeah, and I guess, David, that's certainly one of the key policies, one of the early developed policies in opposition and brought to bear under the new government will be to make childcare more affordable. It's not just to provide support for people who are struggling, but that is, I think, a primary objective. It's also a massive economic policy because there's no doubt we've got labour shortages. We have relatively low unemployment for a variety of reasons, but we do have to increase employment participation, and parents, predominantly women, are not able to enter the labour market or not spend enough time in the labour market because they can't afford childcare. We need to do better there.
Let me ask you, Bridget McKenzie, will you be prepared to back in the Parliament Labor's increased subsidies for childcare?
Well, we were really proud to be able to support parents, particularly like yours, with second and subsequent children having additional subsidy. Brendan, you're talking about subsidies that won't be able to be seen by families till 2023, and subsidising families that are actually earning $500,000, David, $500,000. So we believe that people work very hard for their taxpayer dollars, and that should actually be supporting families that predominantly live in communities like Wyndham, low to middle class income families, to help them assist exactly with the issues you raise around cost of living. Petrol's going up, food's going up, electricity's going up, and you need to be supported as best as possible to meet the cost of running your family.
Okay, but will you vote for it or against it?
I'll see the detail, but I don't believe that we should be subsidising millionaires' childcare subsidies.
All right, you mentioned some of the rising cost pressures. Childcare is not the only one. We've had a few questions from families feeling like they need a second income to get by. Trina Ma, tell us a bit about your situation.
I'm one of those. We're in a single income family at the moment. My husband is an allied health professional working in Melton, and he brings in a good wage. I'm looking after our 12-year-old son with complex extra needs, which is our priority at the moment. We're currently making ends meet and in a better situation than most, but if expenses continue to rise, I will have to go back to work. We're reluctant for me to do this, as not working has had a massive improvement on our son. So what's the plan to get these costs down, the ones that you just mentioned?
Gabriela, let me come to you first on this. I mean, there's a bit in that. Trina obviously would like to be able to stay and look after her son at home. So getting those cost pressures down, is there a plan to get cost pressures down? Is it possible?
Thank you, Trina, for the question. And I really feel for you in having to make that decision. I think, we are really in a perfect storm of cost and financial pressure issues. I think, after we came out of lockdowns, I think a lot of us hoped that things would go back to normal, and then we have the spectre of a war and the oil crisis the energy crisis that's coming up because of that, and then there's a whole bunch of shipping container-related issues as well that have come up and that have made it increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive for us to get the supplies that we need. And now we've got increasing fuel prices as well. So there's a lot of different fronts, and I feel very sorry for Brendan and his colleagues coming into government at this time, because it is a really difficult set of circumstances to be coming into.
Is there anything, though? I mean, the Reserve Bank, obviously, through interest rate rises, is hoping to bring inflation down. But is that it? Is that all that can be done?
Yeah, so I mean, it's part of monetary policy generally is to ramp up the interest rates when the economy is overactive, and we have actually pumped in a lot of money into the economy over the last couple of years, and that's why it's the demand is so strong, and also the lack of migration as well has definitely played a role. I'm keen to see what happens in the October budget and see what kind of supports may or may not be available by the time that comes around. So
we'll see. Alexi, let me ask you, because it's not just families. Small business feel the impact of these rising prices as well. What do you think could be done in Australia to deal with this problem?
Well, certainly small businesses at the moment, we talk about the cost of living, the cost of doing business is increasing as well. And it's almost a daily thought process. You've got another thing coming at you, whether it be energy prices going up, the cost of fuel to move your goods around, but also the cost of freight. International freight costs, we know, have been going up 5- and 6-fold, and lots of small businesses import the goods that they need, the inputs that they need to make their goods and services. And that's everybody from hairdressers to manufacturers. And it's a constant, I think, hit of the next wave of problems that are coming on for small businesses. And as a small business person, what we're hearing from small businesses is that you have to make that decision almost on a daily basis. Is today the day that I start to think about examining whether or not I can continue? Is today the day that I put up my prices? Is today the day that I, let staff go? And it's a constant conversation because everything is moving and fluctuating all the time. And that really wears the small business person down.
Lech, I think we're really hearing tonight, and particularly through Trina's question there, the strain that families are under right now. This cost of living squeeze is very real and forcing some difficult decisions as to what families should do.
Yeah, and I think that the elephant in the corner of the room, and we'll probably talk about it later, is wages. They've been stagnating for a long time. We tend to come at it from the other side sometimes, and we look at all these other ways and solutions, but it seems like the simplest thing that could be done for families is for their wages to be rising in line with, the profits that are being enjoyed by corporations. Certainly, there's been a real shift in the amount of wealth. There's been a massive shift in, even through COVID, it's been exacerbated. So a lot of people who went into COVID without any assets have left COVID without any assets, while a lot of people who do have assets have done quite well during COVID. And so that's put extra pressure on those people at the bottom. And so I think we definitely need to talk about wages and how we can improve them, and how we can improve them for especially low-income workers.
Well, let's get into that issue. Our next question comes from Sean Mahiuddin.
With rising inflation at around 5.2% at this point in time, how prudent was it to raise the national minimum wage at this time? Would that not further contribute to rising inflation, not to mention put undue pressure on small businesses who are already doing it tough?
Before we hear from the politicians on this one, Gabriela, what impact does the rising wage have on inflation?
Look, it's not zero. I think there will, but I think in the decision by the Fair Work Commission, they went through why they thought that should be the case, and part of it is because a lot of those inflation measures have increased so substantially. And we even saw the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia come out and say that those we could see inflation as high as 7%. So it is a really fine balancing act between making sure that those on the minimum wage are able to function and to be able to provide for themselves and their families in this economy. But it is a real, really fine balancing act at the end of the day.
Alexi, what do you think to Sean's question? Is now a good time for a wage increase of 5%?
Well, I think we have to respect the decision of the Fair Work Commission, of course, but it's going to be another impact on small businesses, and not necessarily a lot of small businesses already pay above award, particularly with worker shortages and an unemployment rate of 3.7%. It's hard to get the workers in the first place at the moment in order to pay them. But in a lot of ways, the small businesses are already paying above award in many cases, and also the other issue is that small businesses find it difficult to keep those and retain those workers in a competitive environment. So I think it's an important, in terms of the timing, it's difficult for small businesses to look at that and say, well, that's another reason that I need to increase my costs and put it onto customers. But a lot of small businesses might not be having those minimum awards affecting them, but they're at the end of a supply chain. So all of those impacts of increased costs along the supply chain means for them at the end, their input costs are going to go up, and yet again another decision to make about whether to push the prices up for customers. And that's a daily decision because they've got to compete with big business. And in a lot of cases, such as newsagents or people who are in fixed contracts, they can't put those prices up. So the squeeze is getting more and more difficult, and for small business people, it's getting more and more difficult when you were previously a viable, strong business to continue.
Brendan O'Connor, let me ask you, would you like to see wages rise in line with inflation to avoid a real wage cut?
Well, that would be the ideal. In fact, in a good economy that's growing through innovation and productivity, wages can grow faster than inflation if the economy's growing. Right now, though, we've had low productivity. As Lech said, we've had the lowest wage growth in this decade than any decade in living memory. So wages have been falling. In fact, the only thing that stopped the fall over the last 9 years has been President Ross making decisions to lift or maintain the minimum wage.
This is the Fair Work Commissioner.
President Ross of the Fair Work Commission. I give him he's the author of that decision, and I think he fully understands. He takes into account a lot of factors, but he does understand that aggregate demand is adversely affected. I mean, remember that the customers of small business have to consume the goods and services, they have to have wages at least running at a rate of CPI generally. And now, of course, we've had very significant hikes to inflation prior to the election.
And that's my question. So should wages, because Labor was very clear before the election and after the election in its submission to the Fair Work Commission that wages should go up. Well, the minimum wage should go up by the same as inflation, 5.2%.
That's right.
So do you now think wages for all should go up in line with inflation?
Well, I think there's a number of things here. I think scarcity of labour is a bigger problem for employers than actually the Fair Work case decision because, as Alexi just said, because of scarcity, employers are having to pay more than the minimum rates of awards. And so let's just remember that. When some employers are concerned about the increases, but in fact, they're paying more just to get labour. And one of the reasons for that, yes, I accept the pandemic has done that, but I think the design fault of JobKeeper, I don't want to keep harping on it, but JobKeeper and JobSeeker meant that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were holding visas who were working in the labour market had no support during the pandemic and fled.
We'll come to that.
Effectively left, right?
I'll just ask one more time.
No, but that led to scarcity, which leads to increased wages anyway. But I
accept all that. But should wages rise in line with inflation?
I think that is the ideal, but the way to sustain that is through investing in skills, investing in technology, investing in capital, because productivity rises. It is okay. A good economy can maintain a real wage increase for workers provided productivity is rising.
So do you disagree, though, with the Reserve Bank governor who this week said he would like to see wages rise by only 3.5%, which is half the inflation rate he's forecasting?
Well, I think, frankly, the governor has. I don't agree with that was what he was meaning to say. I think, and I saw that comment, but what I mean by that, David, is that firstly he talked about.
He meant something else, did he?
No, he talked about the projection of 7%. But what he was talking about was what he wants to see the return to, and he wants to see a return of inflation to 2.5%.
Yep.
And then he talked about where wages would go. Now, I know he doesn't want to see necessarily wages to go up with the inflation rates that's projected.
But you do.
No, I've said to you that we have to be very conscious of that, and I think the Fair Work Commission will make that decision. But you're right, we did on this instance say the people on the bottom of the wage rates of this country, $1 increase per hour for the lowest wage rate, was, given the history of the lowest wage growth over this decade, deserve that, firstly. We need a bargaining system that gets mutually good outcomes for employers. We need investment in skills, which is my portfolio, and Jason, Claire and others, because if we increase productivity of the labour market, we can sustain real wage
and
growth.
we'll come to that. Yep. Bridget McKenzie, what do you think about should wages go up with inflation, which is forecast to hit 7%, or is that way too much?
Look, I want Australian workers to be well paid for what they do day in, day out. And I think, we live in very, very challenging economic times. I think Gabriela outlined them beautifully. You know, a global pandemic recovery, the Shanghai port is still closed. You can't find a shipping container for love nor money. And for an island nation like us, very far from other places, these are very, very challenging times, not just for Australia. Now, post-pandemic, we still maintain our AAA credit rating as a result of decisions our government made that put us in one of the best economic positions globally to deal with the recovery phase.
So now,
we have high uninflation.
Should wages go up at the same rate?
We have high uninflation, David, just like other places in the world. The Fair Work's made their decision, obviously. But like the Reserve Governor said, he's going to be putting up interest rates so that the cost of living pressures we put downward pressure on that. And the other thing that has to happen in our economy to put the downward pressure on cost of living prices is for the federal budget measures to be managed very, very tightly, to rein in spending. Now, at our last budget, we started that work, we turned it around to the tune of $100 billion. And so we need to be making sure at the October budget that the new federal government maintains that trajectory, because they're the only two things that are going to actually, in answer to
I'll just ask you one more time, though, if I can. Down. Sorry, just one more time to you as well, because I'm searching for a clear answer here. Should wages go up as high as inflation, which I think people are asking?
Well, David, we all know that when you attach wages to prices, we end up in a wage price spiral that is very, very bad for workers and incredibly bad for our economy. We basically stall. We did that in the 70s. It wasn't a good outcome for many decades as a result. So you ask any economist, they do not want to see a wage price spiral, which is what happens when you attach... Excuse me, Brennan, I sat and listened to you.
Let's just
finish the point.
Polite. Let Bridget finish the point.
You're not in Parliament now.
I'm sure you listened, though.
All right. Finish the point.
We're in different chambers too, so...
We actually have a Fair Work Commission set up by the Labor Party to assess the whole of economy impacts of wage increases. They're the independent arbiter, and they'll be the ones setting that.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think it's really important that wages are a huge issue here. And we need to have a bargaining system that allows for proper bargaining, which is stalled. It doesn't happen in most workplaces anymore, because I think employers have a right to raise issues that they'd like to see happen to change workplaces for the better, and so do workers and unions and so on. But I think the other point too, for governments, it's not just about the wage system, it's also about bringing childcare costs down, reforming the energy market so we can drive energy costs down.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A lot of moving parts.
But when you're talking about purchasing power and cost of living, you have to add all those things. I agree,
but that question's about wages. Let me come to you, because you've actually run a small business, a motel, as I understand it.
Don't ask me about it, please. That's why I've got grey hair, mate.
Yeah, right, okay. What's your perspective then? Because it does seem to be a little bit of a conflict here between the small business owner who's worried about wage growth and having to afford that, and the worker who really needs it to keep up with all these rising costs.
Yeah, I was raised by small business owners. They had mum and dad had a series of businesses. Some of them didn't do very well. Some of their pubs did a lot better. And so I can remember how tough it was in the businesses that didn't do well, like the level of stress that it created. And because we've expanded the idea of small businesses by so much, now they're, I think, anything less than 100. So you start to forget that a lot of these small businesses are one or two people operations. Maybe the motel in Bundaberg, you had maybe 3 employees most. So when you have that amount of pressure and stress, that can create like a real anxiety, and I definitely empathise with that. But I also remember that Dad always believed that the best thing that you can do for the pub itself was to put extra money in the pocket of the punters, because he'd never read a book of economics, but he had Keynes down to an absolute T. So he campaigned against work choices, even though he was a publican and it was going to cost him money. And so that's just an isolated example. But I'm not an economist, so I'll leave the higher order sort of stuff to others. But I do think that we sometimes forget how interconnected everything is, and that small businesses benefit from wage increases because there's more money going back into them.
Could I?
Yeah, well, I want to move to our next question because that does segue us to our next question, which comes from Luke Wilson. Luke.
Hey, I own and operate several burger bars, and currently in small business, we've got supply issues, cost increases, inflationary pressure, reduced sales, energy prices are soaring. So during the election, Mr Albanese came out and said no one could deny our lowest paid income earners a pay rise of $1 an hour. Now, he could have easily given that to them through tax cuts if he was so concerned about it. But did Mr Albanese, before he made that promise, did he consult with anyone in small business to see whether we could actually afford a 5.1% pay increase that covers not just the lowest paid workers, but the 2.7 million people that currently paid under an award?
Alexi, was your organisation consulted at all?
In regards to the wage increase?
Yeah, Anthony Albanese backing the wage increase as he did during the campaign.
Look, we've had constant conversations with both sides of Parliament in terms of what's happening with what was happening during the election. It's complex. Yes, we had obviously discussions about that, but I actually wanted to ask Chris a question. Chris, have you had a wage rise?
This is Luke.
Luke, sorry, that's the next question. Luke, have you had a pay rise in, say, the last couple of years as a business owner? Could you say that you've seen an increase in your wages?
Certainly not since before all the lockdowns that happened a few years ago.
So just to that comment, it's when we're talking about profitability in comparison with wages, the ABS data said in May that only 14% of small businesses saw an increase in their income for that period. Now that's a tiny, minuscule amount compared to the number of businesses that are out there and the number of employees that they also look after. So I think the profitability question needs to be divided. You can't just look at the profits of BHP and Wesfarmers and Woolworths and Coles, all of which have been essential businesses and been able to operate at full capacity throughout the COVID period, and compare them with the profitability of small. If we don't start looking at the data properly and looking at the impact of wages on small businesses, then it's skewed. And I think that that's a really important part when we're having these discussions about wages and the way that they increase and the impact that they have on the biggest employer, which is small businesses. Those conversations need to be the case.
But are you saying, I mean, I know you said you respect the independence of the umpire, the Fair Work Commission here. Are you saying that 5.2% increase for the lowest paid was too much?
What I'm saying is that a small business owner looks at that in the capacity of how they're running a business now. If we were having a conversation just about wages and nothing else, then that would be a completely different conversation. But it's in the economic conditions that small business face themselves in.
So given those conditions, is there a business that you think really can't afford that 5.2%?
But every small business along the way is going to be affected. And whether or not they're paying above award and therefore don't have to raise it by 5.2% because they're already increased.
But you represent small business. Have any of your members said, we can't afford 5.2%?
Yes. Yes, many of those who have minimum award.
So what's happening to them? Are they having to close?
Absolutely. I mean, you only have to walk down the main street and say, we're not open on Sundays. That's 1/7 of your income gone, often more than 1/7. Or we're not operating because we're not offering on-table service. We're only doing takeaways at the moment because of worker shortages, because of these increased costs.
So, Brendan O'Connor, what do you say to that?
Oh, look, I think it's a really difficult decision, and that's why ultimately the decision wasn't made by the government.
But you supported it, you advocated it.
Yes, but we don't for a moment think it's easy. And I think if you look at the pandemic and its impact on businesses or the economy, it's such an uneven application. If I just go down to my local shopping strip and you look at the travel agent that's closed for years, and then you look at the fruit and veg and the butcher who were actually doing very well because no one was going to restaurants, so people were eating more at home. You could see this uneven situation where some are really struggling and others were not actually struggling, paradoxically, in the sense that at least there was more business happening in those shops. So there's no doubt that governments need to look at how the pandemic and other factors impact on businesses and because it is very different from one sector of the economy to another. And small business, and I say this as a former Minister for Small Business, and I was in Cabinet as a small business minister, I absolutely understand that it's very, for many businesses, it's very difficult. And we do need to be very careful. And I know Alexi and I have spoken about this, about what do we do to make it easier for businesses to navigate the system, whether it is wages, whether it is training, whether it is getting access to services that they don't get currently. I think that's a really huge obligation of a government towards, as you say, millions of small businesses in this country.
Luke, let me just come back to you if I can. Tell me about the burger businesses you run. Have you had to pay the 5.2% or will you have to pay the 5.2% increase, and what's that going to mean for you?
We do, but getting across, the conversation was about is to our lowest paid workers, but it affects every award. So my supervisor under the fast food award that works on a public holiday is earning $65 an hour. Well, that's gone up 5%.
I think it's 4.6 for the...
Whatever, but it's everything gone up. But I think the conversation of the $1 an hour to the lowest paid workers isn't true, and I think it's easy for the government to say that when they're spending someone else's money. They're making a commitment, and I've got to pay for it.
But just to be clear, you haven't had to close any business, as Alexi was saying, some others have.
No, we haven't, no.
Okay, but how will you make up the cost? How do you find that?
Well, actually, our prices, it's not only that wage increase, we said all the other costs, so our prices are going to have to go up from 1st of July. I mean, there's another 0.5% increase in super contributions that comes in 1st of July. And yeah, we're under pressure. I run a burger bar, I can't get any lettuce, for example. Yeah, all costs. So we've absorbed it all year, but we've got to pass it on. But my worry is, well, the public out there is already feeling the pressure of inflation. How much will my customers bear? But I can't keep absorbing it because I'll eventually go broke.
Yeah, well, let's not get into the price of lettuce. That'll be a whole extra hour.
I'm happy to get into the price of lettuce.
Okay, but Gabriela, let me just ask you just to round this out. I mean, what you're hearing there from small business, it is tough, but the people who are the lowest paid, I mean, we've heard from everybody else here tonight, it's really tough for them as well.
Yeah.
So is this the right level of increase?
Look, it's been a tough couple of years. Let's just acknowledge that up front. It hasn't been easy for small businesses that have been operating or trying to operate through the pandemic. And at the same time, we've seen that as a society, we've been able to cover the costs to some extent of people who we wanted to stay at homes for the sake of the health of everyone. So, it is really, really tough. I do think that all of us over the next year are probably going to experience some kind of real wage cut. I don't think that that's avoidable, but, we're hoping and kind of almost betting on the fact that that will be enough to push inflation into that 2 to 3%.
All right, our next question comes from Chris Ryan.
We've all heard that hospitality businesses, so I think I might have a solution, are finding it very hard, well, that's what it's all about, to find staff. That's not only in hospitals, but also our nurses and doctors. We also have our farmers here that find it hard to get people to pick fruit. I know you talked about people who are on visas. They obviously took off. We also have many other jobs that can't be filled. Well, there's a solution. It's quite easy. It's actually our pensioners. My question is, the pensioners, the ones who are retired, is there an opportunity for them to get employment? Because at the moment, they're penalised, and they're penalised so much. They lose their pension, even if it's only part-time. And there's people there with skills in their 60, 65, 70 who can actually fill some of these roles and help the economy and help fill the positions that are vacant. And they want to earn an extra income because they're struggling on the pension. So here's a golden opportunity to look after our elderly.
Chris, thank you. This idea comes up a lot wherever you go at the moment, right? For the reasons that Chris outlined. So let me just bounce around quickly, get everyone's thoughts on it. Lech, what do you think? Let the pensioners earn a bit more before they start losing the pension.
Gut instinct is that there's always going to be instances where that's right. Like it really depends on the circumstances and the person, and I can imagine situations where that would be like a really good fit, just depending on the type of work and the person themselves. So yeah, I've got no.
There's a skills shortage. There are skilled workers out there, but is this too expensive, Bridget McKenzie?
No, we've started to move in this direction with the hourly rate. Pensioners could actually start working before they felt a real cut in their pension, and I think there's a real opportunity. Like 70's the new 50, right? But we also need to look at the ag visa. So the ag visa, the new government has cut the ag visa.
No, let's just stick on the pension. Sorry,
but we're looking.
Should we go further than we have and let pensioners earn a bit more before they start to lose their pension?
So I think it's a creative idea that we had already begun to investigate and implement. I think there's a raft of measures around the skilled shortage that we're experiencing, and it doesn't matter whether it's about picking fruit, skilled or unskilled. We are all desperate in the regions and in communities like this to find workforce. The ag visa, the government has to answer the question for Australia's agriculture industry, which was a solution that they've decided, thanks to their mates in the AW,
all right, I think you've slid in a question there on another matter.
Just the free trade agreements that we've signed with India.
We might be able to come back to that, but Brendan O'Connor, back on to pensioners, which is what the question was from Chris. What do you think of the idea?
Well, I think it's a worthy idea to examine the effective marginal tax rates very high for people who receive social welfare income or pension in this case. And I know that's the disincentive to work. People can voluntarily continue to work beyond the pension age in some circumstances, but I think given how tight the labour market is, sure, it could be something we would examine. It's not something we put before the last election, but I think it's something that would be examined in a very tight labour market. It's the same reason why we invested in childcare, to have women enter the labour market or work more hours to increase participation.
So there's bipartisan support to look at this.
I think it's come up before, and I can't. I remember we've talked about that effective marginal tax rate being a disincentive to work for people because it just hits their pension income too much.
Yep. Just to be clear on that, so to get the full age pension, your fortnightly income has to be under $180 for a single, $320 for a couple. For every extra dollar you earn over that, it starts to taper out. So. Alexi, what do you think? Would small business like to be able to hire more seniors?
We'd like to be able to hire more people, full stop. And this is one of the solutions that we have been talking about and speaking with others about. There is no silver bullet. We all know that expression very well. But worker shortages have been top of mind for small businesses for 6 months. You ask any small business owner, worker shortages, worker shortages. Top three issues.
So you'd give it a tick?
We would, but we would like to see it that we'd like to look at engagement available not only for people who are restricted by their pensions, but what about those who might find them, hitting a brick wall with their family tax benefit A and B, for instance? What about the restrictions that visa holders might have at the moment? Lift those restrictions, even if it's temporarily. Give small businesses the access to these workers. They're desperate.
Yep. Gabriela, what do you think? I mean, presumably governments, both persuasions, haven't gone as far as Chris might like because it costs a lot of money. Is that the issue?
Yeah, a part of me thinks that yes, that's an idea that makes a certain amount of sense. Part of me also thinks, we have the age pension that's been sitting there for quite a while. It's one of the biggest spending categories on our budget, and obviously no politician or anyone will ever touch it. I'm scared of this question and touching it, so please, no one throw anything at me. But, I do think we need to have a reasonable discussion about it. I'm well aware that by the time I get to whatever the retirement age is going to be, that age pension is not going to be there anymore. That is not going to be something that I access. So I think it goes back to that intergenerational question as well that we were talking about earlier, and just the amount of debt that my generation is going to have to pay off eventually.
All right. I think we got some progress on that, but thank you, Chris, for the question. Our next question comes from Tristan Knight.
My question is, what is the government genuinely putting in place to ensure that the skilled worker shortages are addressed to assist in keeping up with skilled labour shortages?
Yep.
Brendan O'Connor.
Good question.
Well, I think that's a really important question, and we do need to invest more in the skill shortage areas and the areas of emerging demand in our labour market. And I've spoken with all of the state ministers and the territory ministers today, and we're obviously wanting to work with them, work with industry, work with unions and training providers to really properly match up the investment of taxpayers' dollars in the training sector with those areas that are in demand, And I go to the other point, which is more of an immediate response. We do need to restore the skilled migration stream as well. Now, my priority as the Minister for Skills and Training will be focusing on the domestic labour market, workers here, existing workers or entrants into the labour market. But I'm aware that employers and others will require us to reset the skilled migration stream and also have the appropriate visa holders going into areas of acute shortages, because you can't train someone in a 3-year course overnight, and we've got some areas where they're just crying out for labour right now. So that combination of proper investment in the areas of demand and combined with the restoration of the skilled migration stream is really critical for us right now. There is a global labour shortage and skilled shortage. It's not easy, but we are a very, very attractive destination, as you might imagine, and this country in large part has been built on immigration. It's an important part, an economic part of our story, as well as a multicultural part of our story, and we can see that continuing. The pandemic suspended those streams. And of course, as I said, I believe there was a design fault that also contributed to some leave.
Okay, I think we got that point. Lech, let me ask you, you travelled around Australia as mentioned during the campaign. Did this issue about skill shortages and the balance between bringing in skilled migrants and training up Australian skilled workers, how much did this come up?
Yeah, it came up, and one of the main areas where it came up was aged care. And so talking to, I talked to aged care workers in Billawheeler, for example, and it was all the issues that we talk about, but they were heightened because of the isolation and the lack of investment in these regional and rural areas. And so, yeah, it was quite eye-opening, and yeah, I think that. I think it goes to the whole conversation that we're having about how the type of work that we value and the type of work that we put at the forefront of our economic agenda and our economic narrative.
And like you mentioned aged care, you've got your own personal experience with your mum.
Yeah. So mum passed away in 2018. She'd had a neurodegenerative illness for quite a long time. And so I watched her deteriorate. She was always going to die. There was no, not going to be a cure. But in the space of time from when she got the illness and over the preceding decades before that, there'd been a marked lack of staffing hours over a period of time
in aged care.
And so that directly affected her. Because her condition was so complex, she didn't have the access to nursing, she didn't have the access to expertise, and she really withered away. And it was really confronting to watch. And I can remember taking her to get a haircut, for example, and sitting there and like watching her in the mirror, and it gives you that insight to go, this could be me sitting here one day. Like this is what's happening within our aged care systems, and it really the lack of respect that we have for the workers in these industries. It's a national disgrace.
And Bridget, McKenzie, that's just one and a particularly difficult aspect of the skills shortage that we see right across the economy at the moment. Will you back in what the government wants to do to try and fix these skills issues?
Look, David, and I'm sorry, the previous question, I hear this from Billawheeler to Benalla to Bacchus Marsh. This is the number one issue for business and for our nation. It is getting a skilled workforce. The ag visa, I'm sorry, you want to know why your lettuces are $12? Horticulture, agriculture has been saying as today on all the TVs in the morning, farmers are not planting because they do not have the people to get the crop in. That means the price of food goes up. It's that simple. We had an ag visa situation, negotiating bilateral agreements with Southeast nations in particular. The Labor Party is going to cancel that. Agriculture won't be able to survive. We have free trade agreements with mobility clauses negotiated with both the UK and with India. The new Trade Minister, they're ready to go. They're ready to go into the Treaties Committee in Parliament and to be put before Parliament and passed so those mobility clauses can be operational. The new Trade Minister is saying, we won't be getting to that till the end of the year. this is at crisis point. To both Gabriela and Alexi's point, small business, large business, aged care providers, our allied health system is needing workers. Our borders had to close for a reason. They're open now. Let's get the people in and get us going.
All right, we're going to move to our final question tonight, which comes from Helen Canning. Helen.
The past 2 years have been really tough in so many ways for so many people. The pandemic, floods, bushfires, and challenging economic and financial times. What good things do our panellists realistically believe that we can look forward to over the next 2 to 3 years?
I love this question, and I think it's great to finish with a thank you, Helen, with a little bit of hope, a bit of positivity. And I want to quickly, because we're very tight on time, bounce around everybody here. Gabriela, what's something we can look forward to?
Overseas travel. I'm really looking forward to going and
catch up with your family.
Yeah, going and seeing my family. It's been a long 2 years. I was really lucky that my mum was able to come here in March this year. So I'm looking forward to going back and seeing her.
Yeah, all right. Alexi?
I think we should celebrate what a small business means to community and celebrate what they've done to support community through all of those, those disasters, and in turn keep building up that community spirit through small businesses. There's a lot to be celebrated. They bring people together. They bring a lot of us all here in the audience got our first jobs in a small business. We're proud of small businesses in our community that do well. We want to see them do well, and in turn they help the community flourish. So I think that there's an opportunity here for the next couple of years to continue to support small business and continue to keep them in community and keep those communities unique. Let's not see them become this homogenous big business shop fronts. Let's keep small business in community.
All right. Brendan O'Connor.
Well, I think there's a number of areas, but I do think we should be excited about what we can do when we reform the energy sector. There's some really great opportunities for skilled workers in an area where we invest in renewables, invest in storage, invest in transition, and the skills that will be needed in that sector of the economy will mean great opportunities, really well-paid, secure jobs. That's something I'm looking forward to.
Bridget.
Well, Helen, you're dead right. It's been pretty tough over the last couple of years here in Victoria in particular with lockdown, so bring on the freedom. I'm looking forward to a future pipeline of infrastructure work, not just in regions like this, but more broadly out in rural and regional Australia that will really secure the future of our nation to come. It's exciting.
Thank you. And Lech, what sort of positivity are you going to leave us with?
I'm an optimistic person, so I'm really, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm really looking forward to see how the Parliament plays out. I think that it's going to be a very interesting few years, and there's new competition. Major parties are going to have to innovate and reconnect and re-engage, and I think that's a good thing for democracy. I think there's more people getting involved, and so I think that the more that the major parties can reach out and try and change what they've been doing in terms of the grassroots sort of stuff, I think that's great. And so, yeah, I'm looking to see that and all of the above in Parliament.
I like it. All right. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Gabriela D'Souza, Alexi Boyd, Brendan O'Connor, Bridget McKenzie and Lech Blaine. And a big thanks to all of you here and to those at home for sharing your questions. Next week, we'll be taking a break while the ABC marks a special milestone. Yes, the ABC is turning 90 this year and is inviting you to join the party with ABC 90 Celebrate, a live 2-hour television event next Thursday, kicking off at 8 p.m. And you can join me on Sunday morning for Insiders. Until then, good night.